Welcome, Illumineers and fans of the happiest card game on earth. My name's John T, and you are in the Inkwell. Today, I wanted to talk about power creep, both in games in general and how it specifically applies to Lorcana. First of all, I'll be going over what power creep is. Secondly, we'll look at some specific examples that people have been pointing out in Lorcana, and spoiler alert, how I disagree with them. And thirdly, we'll take a look at how games can manage it. First of all, power creep, very simply, is when new content for a game is released and exists within the same sphere as original content and is so well powered that it makes older content nullified. If in your RPG you can have a +2 sword and then an expansion comes along with a +3 sword, it instantly makes the +2 one no good. Power creep is obviously a big problem in pretty much any game that has new content, whether that's a video game or something more physical. You've only got to take a moment and search for power creep followed by the name of any game you can think of to find numerous videos all over YouTube explaining about it. I honestly think it's really far too early to be talking about power creep in Lorcana, having only seen around about 5% of the second set of the game. But even with that limited card pool, I hear lots of people claiming severe power creep, so I thought I'd take a few moments to look at some of the cards that people are claiming to be too strong and see if we really think they are. Power creep, at least in trading card games, usually comes in one of two flavors. Either you'll find the same ability that a previous card had, but it has a cheaper cost, or we'll have a similar costed card with better base stats. I kind of half joked on the reveal video that Honey Wizard is basically a better version of Jumba Jakiba, and technically he is, but a few people did point out in the comments that this is across two different ink colors, and that isn't really a fair measure because obviously different ink colors have different stat weights in the game. Even within a single set, the first chapter, there are multiple cards that cost the same but have slightly different stats because they're spread over two different inks, and different inks care more about different things. If we suddenly saw a one-costed 1/1 in Amber with 3 lore, that would be a clear indication of power creep, it being basically Lilo but better. But the cards that I've heard a lot of people call power creep against, I don't really think are particularly any stronger than stuff we've already got in set 1. They're just different. Let's take a look at Belle Hidden Archer. She's a 5-costed uninkable 3/3 for 3 lore with shift 3 and the ability Thorny Arrows. Whenever this character is challenged, the challenging character's player discards all cards in their hand. This is a legendary card and is very strong on paper. 3 lore on a body that wants to quest and wants to make it difficult for your opponent to deal with is very strong. But we already have 5-costed 3 lore characters in the game in Emerald, both Cusco and Mad Hatter. And while Belle's ability is basically a better version of Flynn Rider, she's a much higher costed and higher rarity character. Even comparing her to an uncommon and a rare though here, I don't really see that much difference. There are upsides and downsides. Obviously the upside here is that she just has a very good ability and she's going to be shifted onto a presumably a cheaper Belle that we haven't seen yet. Having this come down on turn 3 is pretty insane. But with Just in Time, that is already in the game, you can also get Cusco and Manhattan both on turn 3 as well. All of those are 2 card combos. You could argue that the Just in Time combo is even better because it doesn't require the Belle that we haven't seen yet to stay on the board. How many times have you had a Tiny Tink or a Stitch New Dog destroyed just so you don't have your shift target? She's also an uninkable, which is a downside compared to Mad Hatter, and she only has 3 on her willpower, meaning unlike Cusco and Mad Hatter, she's in range of something like Smash. She's also, again, a much higher rarity than both of these. We can also take a look at Cinderella Stout-Hearted from Rise of the Floodborn. She's a 7-costed inkable 5/5 for 3 lore with shift 5, resist 2, meaning that damage dealt to this character is reduced by 2, and the Singing Sword. Whenever you play a song, this character may challenge ready characters this turn. Most people are comparing her to Tinkerbell Giant Fairy, and they do fill similar kind of slots in their respective decks. But again, I personally don't feel like Cinderella here is incredibly overpowered compared to Giant Tink. Ignoring all of the text on her body, she's a 5/5 for 3 lore compared to a 4/5 for 2 lore, but she is costing 1 more, so that's a relatively standard move up the curve. They both are able to shift onto smaller versions of themselves, and you could argue perhaps perhaps that princess is a slightly more useful classification than ally and fairy. Obviously, this is the first time we've seen knight, so we don't really know how prevalent that's going to be. Resist 2, I won't lie, does feel like a strong mechanic. It instantly negates a lot of the removal that were already found in steel, such as fire the cannons, grab your swords, and a good chunk of what Giant Tink can do. But we're looking at it in a bubble of 13 cards. I imagine we're going to see a lot more non-damage based removal in the set to level it out. And the singing sword mechanic, whenever you play a song, this character may challenge ready characters this turn, is a new way to interact with your opponent's board, but it is going to require a Cinderella already on the board and a song in hand to get the true value out of it. I honestly think that neither of these cards is better than the other one, and they actually just fill different slots in the deck. Giant Tink is going to be the answer you want if your opponent is going wide. Against some of the low-cost aggro decks, she's basically a board wipe, whereas Cinderella Stout-Hearted is going to be the answer that you're looking for when your opponent has a card that doesn't want to exert, but you're getting value out of, something like Dr. Facilier, who can just sit back and let other things bounce back to his hand. This is a great way to remove them. Or something like Heroic Outlaw when your opponent's messing around with Shield of Virtue to re-ready stuff. So neither of them is stronger than the other one, I don't think. I just think they answer different questions in the game. They are what we would call incomparable cards. Which brings me on to my final point. How can we deal with power creep when it does inevitably perhaps happen in these kind of games? And this isn't me attempting to try and tell Ryan Miller and Steve Warner how to develop this. I know for a fact that their team at Ravensburger is much more well-read and educated on these kind of things than I am. This is more of a way to generate some discussion and sort of inform my viewer base. The first way to deal with power creep is don't release any expansions. Obviously, with the catalyst for this video being set 2 coming out, that's not applicable for Lorcana, and it might sound silly, but I still think it's worth mentioning. Having content that comes out and tacks onto already established games is a relatively new idea. It probably started around the D&D time of the 70s. But it's not like chess has got new pieces since it's been relatively established. There's been some slight rules changes, but it's not like we're getting the archer who can take a piece from a distance or the giant who takes up 4 squares. And it's not like Go's ever got a grey piece that both opponents can control. The idea of new stuff coming out for games is in general relatively a new idea, but obviously that's not something we can apply here. The second way you can deal with power creep is just to absolutely let it happen, maybe even embrace it, deal with it. This is obviously something I don't want to happen with Lorcana, but in its own way, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a very successful card game that just embraces power creep. Every single set that comes out, the cards are incredibly strong and pretty much negate a lot of the earlier stuff. And MMOs like World of Warcraft pretty much do this as well. Every time there's a new expansion comes out, you get new gear that's better than the old stuff. Both of those previous games I mentioned do try a little bit of the other things I'm going to mention as well to curtail it a little bit, but for the most part they're just quite happy with their new stuff being better than their old stuff. The third way you can deal with power creep is a sort of planned obsolescence kind of thing, and that's where you just sort of remove the older stuff from gameplay so that the newer stuff can stay at a similar kind of power level but still feel fresh and original. The best example I have of this is something like the standard format of Magic the Gathering, and that basically means that the 5 or 6 newest expansions are always being played against each other, with the oldest ones dropping off, and it means you sort of get like a hard reset of abilities every year too, and you've only got to really build sets around the fact that they're going to be working within those few sets either side of them. Whilst this is a relatively elegant solution to the problem, it does mean that people can get a little bit fed up of their old cards being no good anymore, not just for the soft lock of power creep, but for the hard lock of the game telling you can't play them. And I think it's pretty clear with how popular other forms of Magic outside of Standard, things like Commander, Modern, and Pioneer, are much more popular because they give you a larger card pool to pull from. And the final way to deal with power creep is the magic bullet that solves all of the problems, but is the most difficult to do. And that's something we mentioned before, creating incomparables. Power creep is very clear to see when you're just dealing with numbers. If you have a 2-costed 2/2 for 1 lore, and then you print a 2-costed 2/2 for 2 lore, it's clear that one is just better than the other. But say you printed a 2-costed 2/2 for 1 lore and Challenger 1, and you printed a 2-costed 2/2 for 1 lore with Bodyguard, then we're going to pretty much argue till the cows come home as to which one is better, and most likely, with the example I used of Giant Tink and Stout-Hearted Cinderella just there, each one's probably going to go into a different deck and perform a different task. And this is where most card games try and sit as best as they can. Every new set brings in a new mechanic, and occasionally those mechanics are too strong, but for the most part they just work together with other mechanics that are already in the game. And as the card pool gets larger and larger, new mechanics will often have an answer to them in a combination of older mechanics that are suddenly becoming more relevant again. If we see a big prevalence of the resist mechanic in Rise of the Floodborn, it is going to make the damage focus removal of steel a little bit weaker. But honestly, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's relatively strong right now, and whilst it might make things like fire the cannons and grab your swords not as powerful, stocks are going to rise on other cards such as Mother Knows Best, Let It Go, and of course the hard ruby removal of Dragonfire. And of course, all of the new cards that we haven't seen yet in set 2. Again, I will say this, we are using 5% of the card pool right now for this argument. This is something I've wanted to talk about for a little while because I knew it was going to be a topic of conversation once the game got established, but I wasn't ready to do it this early. The only reason I am is because of how much, kind of surprisingly actually, how much talk of power creep there's been with just these few cards released from Rise of the Floodborn. Power creep is a relatively negative term and usually a relatively negative connotation, but sometimes, it doesn't have to necessarily be a bad thing. When new cards come out, I want them to be strong and I want them to be powerful, but hopefully using a technique of those incomparables and the plan's obsolescence of having some sort of rotating format, the game can establish itself and have interesting and new mechanics that aren't completely broken, making the older stuff obsolete. Will power creep happen in Lorcana? Well, yes, very probably in some way or another. Is it happening right now? We have absolutely no way to tell. But I'm going to err on the fact that the Ravensburger designers know what they're doing. We are still working on an incredibly small card pool, and I don't really think the game is going to completely come into its own until we have set 3, 4, even 5 out. So I don't think it's anything we have to worry about just yet. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, don't forget to subscribe and do all that YouTube goodness. Love you all to bits. Until the next one, be good.